Welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. So, you know, it was 38 years ago today. Richard M. Nixon became the first, and thus far to date, the only president of the United States to resign from office. More or less in disgrace, the final fallout of what had become known as the Watergate scandal. Now, I don't know for sure if this is actually the case, but my suspicion is that there have been more books written about Watergate than any other scandal in American political history. Histories, memoirs, analyses, investigative reports, sweeping narratives. There are shelves and shelves of Watergate books. I know this because I have read dozens of them myself. But to date, there really hasn't been a great work of fiction about Watergate, unless, of course, you want to count all the president's men. Thomas Mallon, one of the truly great contemporary writers of historical fiction, has now filled that void. His new novel, Watergate, is a tour de force of this most perplexing of scandals. His characters are convincingly sketched. This includes the names we know, the names we've half forgotten, and the names we never heard of because they never existed. At least, I don't think they existed, but who knows? Their dialogue is sharp, pointed, often incredibly witty, always believable, and totally in character, even though I'm pretty certain some of these scenes were never that good in real life. The depiction of political intrigue is brilliantly informed, and the descriptions of the settings in 1970s Washington are spot on, including, I might add, the description of one of my favorite bars in Washington, Martin's Tavern in Georgetown, where much of the action takes place toward the end. So, this is a novel, of course, so there's quite a bit of artifice in Tom Mallon's fictional Watergate, but it is artifice so artfully done that it sounds like it could be the truth. And that ultimately is why Watergate is such a terrific read. The fact is, for all we think we know about Watergate, it still remains beyond comprehension how something this ludicrous could actually happen. The pieces of the puzzle still don't fit together precisely. We still don't really know. In Watergate, Tom Mallon offers an explanation, actually a series of explanations that, at least on a theoretical level, sound eminently plausible. It's no surprise that Tom has given us this wonderful literary lens through which to understand Watergate. His previous historical novels, most spectacularly Dewey Defeats Truman, about the 1948 election, and Henry and Clara, about the couple who were fated to sit next to President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln that night in Ford's Theater, are equally illuminating and endlessly compelling. In his spare time, Tom has also written several works of nonfiction. He served as literary editor of Gentleman's Quarterly. He's taught at Vassar. He's received numerous awards and fellowships, and even put in a stint as deputy director of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's currently a professor at the George Washington University in DC, where he directs the creative writing program. I am truly pleased and totally thrilled to have Tom Mallon here today, especially since he just returned from a trip to Africa less than 96 hours ago. I should add that Watergate is for sale, courtesy of our friends at Barnes & Noble, and Tom will be signing copies following his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tom Mallon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that extremely warm introduction. Henry is right. I just got back from Africa several days ago, and adding further evidence to what he was saying about the massive coverage of Watergate over the years, this enormous number of books, and the general, awareness of it as one of the big events of the 20th century. I think it was a week ago today, I was in Zimbabwe. It was on a State Department-sponsored writers' tour, and they were giving us a view of the Great Zimbabwe Monument, where the kings used to live outside Meshvingo, this provincial city towards the south of the country. And we were climbing it, and we came to the portion of it that was called the Watergate, because it was where the water would sluice from the source to where it was stored. And our guide, in his charming, lilting voice, there were about 6 of us, and he said, "Come, good people, come, good people." And he pointed to it, he goes, "I now take you down Avenue Richard Nixon." So it had its kind of worldwide impact, I guess, too. For a novelist who writes the kinds of books that I do, most of which have come out of American history, the novelist finds that not only does history turn into fiction, but historical fiction eventually turns back into history to an extent that, again, to go with something Henry was saying, you sometimes can't remember 10 years later if you made something up or if you didn't. There's a scene in this book where Richard Nixon goes to Alice Roosevelt Longworth's 90th birthday party, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, who lived on and on in DuPont Circle in her mansion decade after decade. And I got an email shortly after the book was published from a man who had been at this 90th birthday party. And he said, "I was at Alice Roosevelt's 90th birthday party on February 7, 1974. Sorry I didn't see you or President Nixon." Alas. Well, Nixon was definitely there. "In any case, when it was my turn to speak with her, such beautiful blue eyes, I told her there was a play at the Kennedy Center going on called Bully, and it was about her father. She said it sounded boring. She asked about the title, and I said, well, your father, he was famous for saying bully whenever he was pleased with something. She replied, nonsense, he never said any such thing." So who knows what's history and fiction and in what order. But Alice, I think I'll start with her. Alice is an important figure in this book. She's sort of my one-woman witches chorus, the commentator on the action. And she was really perfect for the job because she'd been in Washington since 1901. She'd come there at 17 years old when McKinley was shot, and her father, then the vice president, became president. She consistently told biographers of her father, when she was asked, what was your reaction upon the news that President McKinley had been shot? She said, I danced a jig. She made no bones about it. She was delighted that her father was now the president of the United States. She was a hellion by any standard. Teddy Roosevelt famously remarked that he could run the country or control Alice, but not do both. And so he ignored the latter, and she roamed free. She married Nicholas Longworth, who became the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The main House office building in Washington is named for him today. But she famously had an affair with Senator William Borah of Idaho. And it was an open secret in Washington that her daughter, Paulina, who was born in 1925, was really the daughter of Senator Borah, not Nick Longworth, who was very, very patient about putting up with this and very good about the whole thing. The only place where he drew the line was Alice, in her way, had wanted to name the girl Deborah, Deborah, of Borah. And he thought that was a bit much. And so the girl was called Paulina instead. Alice was a horrible mother. And Paulina committed suicide when she was in her early 30s. And it was one of the things that bound Alice to Richard Nixon, who was quite friendly with her from the time he arrived in Washington in the late 1940s. Alice was a very good handicapper of political success, and she spotted him as a comer right from the start. And she was quite friendly with him and the whole Nixon family. She wound up being a wonderful grandmother. It was left to her to raise the daughter that was left of the daughter who killed herself. People were horrified. They thought Alice was going to repeat all of this again. But she proved to be this fabulous kind of anti-Mame grandmother, who got on very well with the young girl. She was famous for her wit and her nastiness. She's the woman who said that Calvin Coolidge looked as if he'd been weaned on a pickle. It was always attributed to her that she had said that Thomas E. Dewey looked like the little man on the wedding cake, although it was actually somebody else who said that. And she had a pillow, famously, in her DuPont mansion, which said, if you can't say anything nice about somebody, come sit by me. And I picked her because she had this long memory. She had seen everything in Washington. Alice knew veterans of the Civil War when she was a young woman. And she lived through Teapot Dome. She had seen scandals come and go. She'd seen politicians come and go. And because she was who she was, she sort of is this kind of controlling presence in some way of the book. As I say, she was friendly with Nixon. She liked Mrs. Nixon very much. She liked the whole family. When Washington Post reporters would interview her for profiles, they did a big piece on her every time she had a birthday. They would always try to get her to say something about Nixon and Nixon's latest troubles. And she said, I'm not going to say a word against him. She said, I like him. I like the whole family. And then she would say, except Tricia, what's wrong with her? And it didn't impede her friendship with the whole family. She was avid as a follower of Watergate, and at one point she kept a kind of notepad of things, and toward the end, when it looked as if Nixon would really probably have to go, she wrote on her notepad, I think the clock is dicking. At that 90th birthday party, Nixon, when he left, the reporters asked him, what do you think Mrs. Longworth's secret to a long life is? And he said, well, it's because she doesn't get obsessed with the pettiness of things the way we all do here in Washington. She prefers to look at important things. And a reporter went back to her with this comment, and she said, do you mean Watergate? She said, can't get enough of it. My only other possibility for this function, for my witches course, as I say, was Martha Mitchell. And if you're of a certain age, you remember Mrs. Mitchell. Very flamboyant character, loud, funny, a great kind of Southern belle, married to the Attorney General, and very much a player in what happens in Watergate. Nixon really blamed the whole thing on her because John Mitchell, her husband, by that time was running his campaign early in '72. He had left the Attorney General's office. And Martha, who had so many problems, was deeply alcoholic and had all kinds of really, really serious emotional problems, was a terrible distraction to Mitchell. The Mitchells, they were each other's second spouse, were improbably enough a real love match. John Mitchell really loved Martha. Their parting was very, very bitter. I mean, Watergate destroyed their marriage. But Mitchell was so upset by what was going on and so much trying to keep after Martha's treatment and whatever in the spring of '72 that, as Nixon would come to believe, he wasn't really minding the store. And he thought if Martha hadn't been as bad off as she was, this whole thing wouldn't have happened. But he would never throw Mitchell to the wolves. If he had done that at the beginning, if he had gotten John Mitchell to go out and say, this is all my fault, I never should have had these clowns on the payroll, etc., the whole thing might have stopped right there. But he couldn't do it. John Mitchell was, to some extent, he believed the man who had made him president. He had managed his campaign in '68 and had really brought him back from the political dead. And so he would not do that. The book, the story as I have it, is told through 7 different characters, what in the creative writing biz we call POV characters, point of view characters. Even though the book is in the third person, the chapters alternate, and with each one you see events from the perspective of one of these 7. One of them is Alice. The others are Fred Larue. Unless you're a real Watergate buff, you probably don't know that name. Fred Larue was a very shadowy Mississippian. He worked for no dollars a year. He did a lot of favors for John Mitchell. He had been involved in Republican politics in Mississippi from the time of the Goldwater campaign. Very quiet, very soft-spoken, a real gent in some ways, but spooky, very spooky, name not in the White House directory, no business card, no fixed office, but he did a lot for Mitchell and for the campaign. And it fell to him to be the conduit between the White House and the burglars when it came time to pay the hush money. Larue is the man who orchestrated all of these payments, which went into the realm of about $300,000 and showed signs of going far higher than that. As Nixon famously said, we could get $1 million if we needed it. Larue also, I knew he was going to be a character in this book when I read that in 1957, when he was 29 years old, he had accidentally, in a hunting accident, shot his father, killed him, and inherited $1 million. I, in the course of this book, connect these two things preposterously, but I hope plausibly and entertainingly. And the mystery of what really happened in the duck blind when Fred shot Daddy accidentally is a big secret that he has beneath the secrets he's newly keeping about the hush money. Mrs. Nixon is a very big character in the book. In fact, I just got the cover for the paperback, and she is the cover with Richard Nixon, this picture of the two of them together. Mrs. Nixon is probably, she was more discussed by reviewers than anything else. More than anything else, the reviewers focused on the story of her. She's presented very sympathetically, very warmly. She's not at all plastic Pat, as they used to call her. Mrs. Nixon interested me a lot in my researches. She was a chain smoker, much funnier than people thought she was, very sharp opinions, revered by both of her daughters and I think by her husband, detested politics. Only time she was happy in her life was that period of a half dozen years when they lived in New York in the 1960s, after his defeats to John Kennedy and in the California governor's race. He came back, he went to New York, became a lawyer. His partner was John Mitchell. And she was finally leading the kind of life that she liked. She was a totally private person, never gave interviews, went to museums, went to bookstores, went to Elizabeth Arden. Her girls were in school. She was the wife of a prosperous Republican lawyer. It was the life that she had always wanted. It's the life she might have lived in Pasadena if Nixon hadn't gotten into politics. But of course he was going to get back into politics. He was dead without politics. But what I have in the book that was, insofar as a novel can be controversial, was the most controversial part with reviewers. I imagine Mrs. Nixon having had a brief affair in New York with an invented character named Tom Garahan, who's this retired, gently Irish trust and estates lawyer. They have this brief, tender romance for a period of a number of months, which Mrs. Nixon gives up. She remains loyal to Nixon through everything that lay ahead, but there's still this soft spot she has for Tom Garahan, and they very, very occasionally communicate. The man who reviewed the book in the Wall Street Journal, Frank Gannon, who used to work for Nixon. In fact, he has a few lines of dialogue in the book. I know of no other instance, certainly in my own career, where somebody who's actually a minor character in the book reviewed it. But he was very nice to the book overall, thought the book was entertaining, whatever, but was made very queasy by this. And said, Mrs. Nixon has living daughters, really, how can you do this, and so forth. And I mean, my feeling was that this, to me, was part and parcel of what was a very warm depiction of Mrs. Nixon, a very full depiction. Yes, it was made up, the affair, but this, I think, is what novelists do with history. You try to get at some bigger truth by creating some small particular lies. And I somehow felt, when I know that is a paradox, and it's a good rationalization, too, for a novelist, but I really felt that when I had Mrs. Nixon thinking about Tom Garahan, talking about her, even though this wasn't real, I knew this was my invention, I felt that when I was doing that material in the book, that I was getting at the real her, that somehow this lie led me to the truth of how she thought, how she spoke, how she acted. She was a very enigmatic figure. Of all First Ladies, I think only Mrs. Kennedy was less known, did fewer interviews. And once she left, 38 years ago today, when that helicopter went up from the South Lawn, there was dead silence in the helicopter. And the only person to break the silence when the helicopter was circling the Washington Monument was Mrs. Nixon, who said, "It's so sad, it's so sad." And she went home to California and never gave another interview in her life, and spent most of it in very poor health. If you don't think there was some love and affection between the Nixons, which a lot of people have doubted over the years, watch the clip of Richard Nixon at Pat Nixon's funeral in 1993, a year before his own death. You will never have seen anybody look as shattered as he does. He's convulsed with sobs. And so she's very much a part of the book. Howard Hunt, one of the burglars, a CIA agent, who had come to work for these secret operations at the White House. Howard Hunt is the only one of the characters I knew. I knew him because, like a number of Watergate figures, he was a brown man, class of 43, I believe. I was class of 73. I met him one time when I came back to the college during commencement to give a talk, and he was at a party given by a man who had been my old professor and a classmate of his. And we got to talking. He gave me a business card. He was out of jail. As you know, he, or may remember, he had written a lot of spy thrillers. That was the sideline that he had. I was, in those days, as Henry mentioned, I was the literary editor at GQ. Norman Mailer's big spy novel, Harlot's Ghost, about the CIA, was coming out. We wanted to cover it. I decided I'll call up Howard, ask him to write about the book. He had written spy novels. Actually, it occurs to me, Frank Gannon, not the only one. Howard is a minor character in Norman Mailer's novel, Harlot's Ghost, and I had him review that book. So there is precedent for it. And I got to know him a little bit. I have about a few dozen letters from him. He was one of these guys who used to warm up at the typewriter in the morning by writing a lot of short notes. And it occurred to me 20 years later, I wished I had asked him so many things, but at the time, I wasn't really thinking about Watergate. I did ask him one time if he ever heard from Charles Colson anymore. And he said, yeah. And he said he sends me his books all the time, and he always inscribes them, "Yours in Christ, Chuck." And he made this up-chuck gesture. He had no time for Colson and no time for Richard Nixon. A man that he had tried to blackmail. For all of Nixon's crimes, which were considerable, that was the hardest part of being with Howard, having a drink with him, whatever. Every so often, you would remind yourself, I'm sitting with a man who tried to blackmail the President of the United States. Never mind that the President took the bait. It was still a queasy-making thing to think about. Elliot Richardson, whom we remember as a hero of Watergate, the man who was sacrificed during the Saturday Night Massacre. In my book, he is a pompous, ambitious windbag. I don't know why. The more I read about him, the more I saw tremendous ambition in him, tremendous drinking. Richardson would never have been confirmed today for all of the many cabinet posts that he held, not with his driving record. And he was more complicated. Yes, he performed very well. He did some very good things in Watergate, some essential things. But he had his own shiftiness, his own ambition. And one of the men who recognized that, one of the men who knew that Elliot Richardson wanted to be president was Richard Nixon. And if you listen to the tape of the phone call, the night that Nixon makes him Attorney General, it's after he's fired Haldeman, fired Ehrlichman, fired Kleindienst, Mitchell's replacement as Attorney General. He makes Mr. Clean, his Republican liberal Brahmin, Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, hoping that will put an end to it, not knowing that 6 months later, he and Richardson will have the biggest explosion of all. But the night he appoints him, he says to him on the telephone, Elliot, this could take you all the way. And what he wants him to do is investigate it, yeah, prosecute it, whatever, but also contain it. And he says to him, he's pressing a little bit. He says, you know, Elliot, I'm not sure you really need a special prosecutor meaning Archibald Cox, whose firing would cause the explosion between Nixon and Richardson. And Richardson gives him a little bit of a pullback at that point and says, well, Mr. President, he has that sort of malocluted, waspy voice. When you sometimes can barely understand him on the tape. Well, Mr. President, I'm not sure about that. I might need a special way. And Nixon, who is in no position to overplay his hand at this point, backs off right away and on the tapes says, Elliot, you do whatever you need to do. I'll back you to the hilt. If you want to, you can dig up Charles Evans Hughes and appoint him special prosecutor. Rosemary Woods, the president's extremely loyal secretary, is also a big character in the book. One of the things, I didn't set out to do it, but one of the things that the book does is really bring the women of Watergate to the fore. The women are at least half the story here, which is usually not the case in tellings of this tale. Rosemary Woods lived in the Watergate, as did Fred Larue, as did the Mitchells. I live across the street from the Watergate in Washington. I look out on it every day, and I never really knew, I knew the Mitchells lived there, but I didn't know that so many of the figures lived there, and that the novel would, even after the burglary, have to keep going back into the building for a number of scenes to be set. I do try to tell the story of what may have accounted for that 18.5-minute gap, what may really have motivated it. But Rose was a very complicated, also extremely private person, like Mrs. Nixon, did not give interviews. Nobody really knew why she came to Washington. There were all kinds of stories that she had had cancer while she was a girl, that she had lost the man she was engaged to during World War II. In any case, she did come to Washington with what were always known as government girls. She became a secretary there and joined Richard Nixon's Senate staff in 1950, so she'd been with him all of those years. She reminded me, the more I thought about her, of my Irish aunts, and I felt I sort of understood her, and that her feelings were important to bring in. But of course, the main figure is Nixon himself. And most of these books that I've written about history have looked at these big events, like the Lincoln assassination, through peripheral figures, the couple in the balcony, so forth, minor characters, people on the fringes. And one of the things my editor was doing with this book, he was pushing me to go into the big figures as well as the peripheral figures, and that included Nixon. And so he's one of these point of view characters. You see some of this through his own eyes, through his own emotions. Richard Nixon straddled my life, I think, more than any other political figure. He was a famous man when I was born, and I turned 60 last fall, but he was already in the Senate. He was about to run for vice president. I had a rapidly pro-Nixon father who'd been an old New Dealer, but by 1960 was very much in the Republican camp. He'd sort of traveled Ronald Reagan's political route. I went off to 4th grade every day in the fall of 1960 with a Nixon Lodge button. I used to lecture my fellow 9-year-olds that John F. Kennedy didn't have enough experience to be president, which is a very out there position for a 9-year-old to take. And of course, Nixon, by the time he became president, was when I was in college. My college years encapsulated Cambodia, Kent State, the China trip, the end of the Vietnam War, the end of the draft, for which we were all very grateful to him, even if we weren't going to say it. The draft ended the month that I graduated. He fascinated me for my whole life. I don't know what it says about me, but I think on some level I identified with him. There was something about the underdog, the defeats. In school debates, I was always playing George III or Jefferson Davis. I was very obsessive about history and politics, but I was particularly interested in defeat and comebacks and so forth. Roger Ailes, the man who now runs Fox News, he was a very young media person on Nixon's '68 campaign, and he said at the time, I don't know what we're going to do with this guy, he's so stiff and so forth. He said, you know what he's like? He's the kind of guy who, when he was 10 years old, everybody else got a football for Christmas. He got a briefcase, and he was happy. And this story got into the press not long after the election, and I remember hearing it and thinking, what's your point? 'Cause I was very much that kind of sort of striver. And Nixon, I mean, the workaholic aspect of Nixon, you know, he fell in love with Pat Nixon at first sight. She did not fall in love with him at first sight, but she was dating other guys. But the guys she was dating did not have cars. And Nixon said, I'll drive you on your dates. And he did. He drove her on a number of dates, chauffeured her around, and he just wore the other guys down. And this kind of persistence is very key, I think, to understanding him. I once shook his hand. I shook her hand, too. They came through my town in '68. By that time, I was a senior in high school, and this was the election, of course, that he won. They came down Hempstead Turnpike in an open car. How this was allowed 6 months after Martin Luther King's killing and Bobby Kennedy's killing is beyond me. But that's how it was. It was this big, white, open Lincoln. And Nixon got up on the trunk and made what I recognized even then as an awful speech full of these World Series metaphors and so forth. It was October. And Mrs. Nixon was sitting on the top of the back seat of this convertible. And I leaned in, and she shook my hand. She was very pretty. She said hello to me. And I remember looking down, and the sight stuck with me all of these years. She had her feet planted on the back seat. She was sitting on the ridge car, and she was wearing very spiky heels, and they were digging into the red leather of the car's upholstery. And you know, at 17 years old, I scarcely knew what pornography was, but there was something about this image that lodged in my head. And something, the spike heels, the leather upholstery, it must have suggested hidden depths to me. And maybe that's why I gave Pat Nixon Tom Garahan in the book. Nixon was, and I'm not going to talk too much longer because it's very easy to get a discussion of Richard Nixon going, and I'm happy to answer lots of questions. But he occupied this very central position in my life. I mean, even in college, when I had moved away from my father's politics, I found him infuriating and exasperating, even as there was a part of me that continued to be sympathetic and weirdly identifying with him. As the years went on, I found my way partway back to my father's politics. But Nixon, it was always Nixon, alive until '94, by which time I was in my 40s. And I remember very, very vividly the night he died in 1994. And I came home with my partner. We'd been out listening to music, and the television came on with the news that Richard Nixon had died. And I stood there in front of the TV, and I was racked with sobs. Racked with sobs. As you can imagine, this has become a kind of family story. My partner kind of, okay, I'll give you a minute. And it was not because I had anything like unmitigated admiration for Nixon. I didn't, but he had gotten into me so deep. It was like losing somebody that he was just part of nature to me. I could not remember a time when he was not around, and he had affected me. He had given me so many emotional highs and lows. There was an editor, James Atlas, in New York, who during the 90s was putting together what was called the Penguin Brief Lives series, short biographies, 175 pages maybe, a whole series of them of major figures. After Henry and Clara came out, he said to me, he called me up and took me to lunch, and he said, would you like to do Lincoln for the series? And I said, Jim, I don't think so. How many thousands of Lincoln books are there? What am I going to do? Just sit there reading and reading and reading them and synthesizing them. into something. I'm not going to have anything to add to this, no original point of view. And so he said, okay, you know, and we just had one of those writer-editor lunches in New York. But I remember when we left the restaurant, the last thing I said to him as we were going out the door, I said, but you know what? Don't ever give away Nixon without at least calling me. He never did for Nixon, but I think I always knew I would write about him in some ways. I did not know it would be in a novel, and I did not know that it would concern Watergate. But by the time I got to Washington, actually lived in Washington, I'd spent a lot of time there over the years, I found myself living literally across the street from the Watergate. It's as if the 1960 election, Nixon Lodge, experience counts. It's as if it's still going on. When you look out my study window, the two big white buildings that stand next to each other and just glare at each other are the Watergate and the Kennedy Center. And so they're sort of facing off forever into history. And in just the way that things happen, the subject gradually accrued in me, and I knew that I was going to do it as a novel. And the only thing further I would say about writing a novel about all this is it's one of the very few subjects I've ever had, fiction or nonfiction, where I wished there was less material to consult. Usually when you're researching anything, you always want more, more, more. With this, we have a whole shelf after shelf of memoirs that the participants wrote, sometimes only to pay their legal bills. They wrote a book. I mean, let me tell you, the memoirs of Jeb Stuart Magruder have not been much read in the last 30 years, but they're still there. There are all of the histories, there are all of the court transcripts, there are all the committee transcripts from the Irvin Committee, from the Judiciary Committee, and of course, there are the tapes. And many of the tapes now you can listen to on YouTube. You don't have to do anything complicated with the National Archives to get them. You can hear the audio, and they put up still pictures of them. And so for about 3 years, Richard Nixon's was often the last voice I heard before going to bed. I worked late at night a lot of the time, and I would listen to him, and I would hear him in all of his complexity on those tapes. Shrewdness, sometimes flashes of brilliance, conducting the foreign policy of the United States in the worst months of Watergate at a really visionary level, not just minding the store, but still going forward with these enormous initiatives. The pettiness, the horrible profanity, the bigotry, the locker room talk. He worshiped toughness. He never felt he could be tough enough, and he never felt he was as tough as the people he was up against. He was always the runt on the football squad. And this worship of toughness always leads to his undoing, always leads to his most awful, embarrassing moments, which he was winding up preserving forever. But I must say, up until I wrote this book, I always used to wonder about Robert Caro. And I always used to think, how on earth does he spend year after year, decade after decade with Lyndon Johnson? I sort of got it. After 3 years with Richard Nixon, the complexities of Nixon, another tormented figure really, like Johnson, a man, both of them men with great gifts, great talents, and even great achievements, but with this impossible, awful, nasty side to them. And it's human nature when you're looking at both of those sides to try to somehow reconcile them. And I think even after 3 years with Nixon, I don't feel finished with him yet. And I don't know what. There's a whole raft of Nixon books coming out this fall, and I'll probably wind up writing about some of them. So in any case, I'm glad, I can see from the nods, I'm glad that there are some people in the audience old enough to have traveled through these years as I did. And I do think that it's a book that one can read without having lived through it. There's a long dramatis personae in the front, and you can always check anything on Wikipedia, another example of historical fiction, very often, as you read, but I would not deny that it's a much easier read if you've actually lived through the period. In any case, I would be delighted to take questions on anything related to it. Thank you.